There are thresholds in your life that you only recognize in retrospect. They aren't grand, arched doorways flanked by marble columns, but simple, unassuming frames you pass through without a second thought. For me, that threshold was the door to my own apartment, propped open by a rubber wedge on a Tuesday evening in October while I hauled in groceries. It was an ordinary moment, one of 1,000 identical ones, until a blur of golden fur and uncoordinated paws shot past my legs, trailing the scent of wet leaves and dog shampoo. And just like that, the quiet, ordered world I had so carefully constructed around myself was breached. The silence that had existed between apartment 7A and 7B for over a year was not just broken. It was shattered by the frantic, happy panting of a runaway retriever who now stood in the center of my living room, tail thumping a joyous, chaotic rhythm against my coffee table. I stood there for a long moment, a bag of apples in one hand and my keys in the other, caught in a state of suspended animation. My apartment, my sanctuary, had an intruder. A very friendly, very fluffy intruder, but an intruder nonetheless. It was a space curated for one. The books on the shelves were arranged not by author or genre, but by the emotional weight they carried. The photographs on the walls, my photographs, were all landscapes, vast, empty, and serene spaces that echoed the geography of my own inner world. Nothing in this room was accidental, and nothing was ever out of place. Until now. The dog, whose name I would soon learn was Buster, let out a soft woof, as if to ask what was taking me so long, then proceeded to investigate a promising-looking dust bunny under my sofa with the intense focus of a bomb disposal expert. Then came the second sound, the one that truly marked the crossing. A voice from the hallway, laced with a familiar timbre I'd only ever heard through drywall, but colored now with a frantic edge I'd never imagined. Buster? Buster, come on, buddy. Where'd you go? It was him. The man from 7B. Liam. I knew his name from the occasional package left by my door by mistake. I knew the cadence of his footsteps, the low rumble of his voice on late-night conference calls, the specific, resonant click of his deadbolt. He was a collection of sounds, a ghost who shared my wall, a complete stranger whose life I had pieced together from acoustic fragments. And now, he was standing in my doorway. He was taller than I'd pictured, his frame filling the space, casting a long shadow into my carefully lit room. His hair was a mess, dark and damp from the autumn drizzle, and his eyes, wide with a mixture of apology and panic, were the color of moss after a rainstorm. He was wearing a faded university sweatshirt and gray sweatpants, and for the first time, the disembodied presence from next door resolved into a person. A tired, stressed, very real person whose dog was currently trying to befriend my furniture. "Oh," he said, his voice softer now that he'd located his furry fugitive. He ran a hand through his already chaotic hair, a gesture of profound exasperation. "I am so sorry." The leash slipped. "He's usually not like this." He looked from me to the dog and back again, a sheepish, almost boyish grin flickering at the corners of his mouth. It was a disarming expression, and it did strange things to the steady, predictable rhythm of my own heart. For a year, he had been a theory, a set of data points. Seeing him like this, flustered and real, felt like discovering a new primary color. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. I realized I was still just standing there, holding my apples like a shield. I cleared my throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Buster had ceased his investigation and was now looking between us, his head cocked, as if waiting for his two favorite humans to finally get acquainted. The silence stretched, a thin, fragile membrane between our two worlds. And I knew, with a certainty that felt like a premonition, that whoever I was before this moment, before this dog and this man and this shared, awkward silence, I was about to become someone else entirely. The threshold had been crossed. Before Buster's grand invasion, my life next to Liam was a study in negative space. It was defined not by what we shared, but by the thick, sound-dampened wall that separated us. I had moved into apartment 7A 13 months prior, seeking refuge from a life that had grown too loud, too demanding. My work as a freelance landscape photographer allowed me the luxury of solitude, and I embraced it like a religion. My apartment was my darkroom, my studio, my monastery. The world existed for me primarily through a lens, a frame that allowed me to observe without participating, to capture beauty without having to touch it. I preferred the company of light and shadow to that of people. They were more predictable, their behavior governed by the reliable physics of the sun's rotation rather than the chaotic whims of human emotion. My days had a rhythm, a monastic quietude. The morning light slanting through the large picture window, the hum of my computer, the scent of developing chemicals, the soft click of the camera shutter. These were the sounds of my life. And then there were the sounds from next door. Liam had moved in a month before I did. From the start, his presence was a constant, low-grade hum against the silence of my own existence. I learned that he woke up at 6:30, the muffled thud of his feet hitting the floor a more reliable alarm than my own. I learned he sang in the shower, usually off-key classic rock, his voice a cheerful, watery rumble. I learned he had friends over on Thursdays, their laughter a wave that would swell and crash against our shared wall before receding into the late-night quiet. I learned he worked from home some days, the murmur of his voice on calls a steady, professional drone. He was an auditory ghost, a narrative I constructed from noise and inference. In my mind, he was Liam the extrovert, Liam the successful, Liam who had people. He was a vibrant, technicolor life lived in the periphery of my grayscale one. Our physical interactions were fleeting and exquisitely awkward, confined to the liminal space of the hallway. A shared nod while waiting for the elevator. A mumbled, "Excuse me," as we navigated around each other with bags of groceries. A brief, startling moment of eye contact when we both reached for our mail at the same time. In those moments, I would feel a jolt, a dissonant chord struck between the phantom I had created and the physical man standing before me. He had a way of smiling that was slightly lopsided, as if he was always holding back a private joke. His eyes, which I had only glimpsed, seemed to hold a deep well of exhaustion beneath their friendly surface. I would retreat into my apartment, my heart hammering a strange, unfamiliar rhythm, feeling as though I'd touched a live wire. I would tell myself it was just the discomfort of proximity, the natural static of two solitary orbits briefly intersecting. But it was more than that. It was a nascent, terrifying curiosity. I started to observe him more consciously, not just through the wall, but through my window, which overlooked the small park across the street where he walked his dog. I'd sit in my armchair, a book open in my lap, and watch him. I learned the way he threw a frisbee, a fluid, powerful motion of his entire body. I learned the way he would kneel down to speak to Buster, his voice a gentle murmur that the wind would carry away. I learned the way the late afternoon sun would catch in his dark hair, turning the edges to bronze. I photographed him once, from my window, when he wasn't looking. It was a stolen moment. He was sitting on a bench, staring off into the distance, his face a mask of contemplation. Buster's head was resting on his knee. The resulting image was technically perfect. The composition was balanced, the light was soft and golden, but it felt like a lie. It was a beautiful surface that hinted at a depth I couldn't access. It captured his loneliness, or perhaps it only captured my own and projected it onto him. I printed it, a small 5x7, and tucked it away in a drawer, a secret I kept even from myself. This quiet, one-sided relationship, this strange intimacy built on proximity and silence, became the central architecture of my loneliness. He was the sun around which my quiet planet orbited, and he had no idea I even existed beyond a name on a mailbox. The real shift, the seismic event that cracked the foundation of our separate worlds, didn't happen on the night Buster ran into my apartment. That was merely the first tremor. The earthquake came 2 weeks later. It was a Thursday night, which was usually friend night next door. I had grown accustomed to the familiar cadence of it. The arrival of voices around 7, the crescendo of laughter and music, the gentle tapering off after 11. But this Thursday was different. There was only one other voice, a woman's. I'd seen her with him a few times in the hallway. She was beautiful in a way that seemed both effortless and intimidating. Their voices started low, a tense and indecipherable murmur. But gradually, the volume escalated. The politeness frayed, and the raw, ugly sounds of a relationship tearing itself apart began to bleed through the wall. I sat on my sofa, trying to read, but the words on the page were just black marks. Her voice was sharp, accusatory. His was a low, wounded rumble, punctuated by long, heavy silences. I couldn't make out the specific words, and I didn't want to. It felt like a profound violation to be hearing this, like pressing my ear to the door of a confessional. I put on headphones, turning my music up until it was a roaring wall of sound, a desperate attempt to build a barricade against their pain. But even through the music, I could feel the vibrations, the percussive shockwaves of their anger. A raised voice, a sound like a book being thrown against our shared wall. And then, the definitive, soul-shaking slam of a door, followed by a silence so absolute and profound it was louder than all the shouting that had come before it. After a long while, I took my headphones off. The silence from next door was different now. It wasn't the peaceful, ambient silence of an empty apartment. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with unspoken grief. I thought of the photograph in my drawer, of the contemplative look on his face in the park. I had mistaken it for pensiveness, for simple solitude. I realized now it might have been sorrow. The sounds from 7B changed in the days that followed. The early morning thud of his feet on the floor was replaced by a dragging shuffle much later in the day. There was no more off-key singing from the shower. The Thursday night laughter vanished. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear a single, muffled sound, something that might have been a sob, quickly stifled. The vibrant, technicolor life next door had faded to gray. The ghost who shared my wall was no longer a cheerful phantom. He was a haunting. And I, the quiet observer in my sealed-off world, found myself aching with a useless, impotent empathy for a man I barely knew. A man whose heart I had just heard breaking through a layer of plaster and paint. The first knock on my door came a week after the fight. It was late, nearly 10 o'clock. The sound was so unexpected that I physically flinched. No one ever knocked on my door. My world was one of emails and text messages, of interactions buffered by screens. A knock was a raw, analog intrusion. I looked through the peephole and saw Liam standing there, his shoulders slumped, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished. I opened the door a few inches, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. "Hey," he said, his voice raspy. "Sorry to bother you so late. This is a weird question, but do you have any aspirin? I've got a splitting headache and I just realized I'm out." It was such a mundane request, such a normal, neighborly thing. But coming from him, after everything I had overheard and inferred, it felt momentous. It was an excuse. I knew it, and I think he knew I knew it. He wasn't just asking for aspirin. He was asking for a moment of human contact. He was reaching across the void. I could have just handed him the bottle and closed the door, retreating back into my safe, quiet world. But I saw the deep, dark circles under his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hand as he gestured vaguely at his head. And I heard myself saying words I hadn't planned. "Yeah, of course. Come on in for a second." I opened the door wider, and he stepped across the threshold for the second time. This time, there was no chaotic, happy dog to buffer the interaction. It was just us. The air in the room felt thick with unspoken things. I went to the bathroom to get the aspirin, my movements stiff and self-conscious. When I came back, he was standing in the middle of the living room, looking at the photographs on my wall. "You took these?" he asked, his voice full of a quiet awe. He was looking at a large print of a salt flat at dawn, the horizon a seamless blend of pale pink sky and cracked white earth. It was a picture of perfect, desolate beauty. "Yeah," I said, handing him the bottle and a glass of water. "It's what I do. They're incredible," he said, his eyes still on the wall. "They make you feel so calm. And really, really small." He finally looked at me, and for the first time, his gaze was direct, unguarded. "I feel really, really small right now." It was a confession, dropped into the quiet space between us. It was a raw nerve exposed. And in that moment, The carefully constructed narrative of Liam the extrovert, Liam the effortlessly cool, dissolved completely, leaving only this broken, lonely man who was looking for a little bit of calm in a stranger's apartment. He took the pills, thanked me, and left. But the ritual had begun. The door between our worlds, once sealed, now had a hairline crack. And over the next few weeks, he would begin to push it open, little by little, seeking refuge in the quiet space I had built to keep the world out, a space that was now, inexplicably, starting to feel like it had been waiting for him all along. The aspirin was the first pebble in an avalanche of pretext. A few days later, it was a request to borrow a cup of sugar. Then, it was a question about the building's recycling policy. Each knock on the door was a test, a gentle push against the boundary I maintained. Each time, I let him in. Our conversations were brief, circling around safe, impersonal topics, but the subtext was deafening. He was lonely. He was adrift. My quiet, ordered apartment, the very space I designed as a fortress against emotional chaos, had somehow become his harbor. The true turning point, the moment the ritual solidified into something tangible and recurring, came on a rainy Tuesday night about a month after the breakup. The knock was hesitant this time. When I opened the door, he was standing there, soaked from walking buster, looking more lost than I'd ever seen him. "Hey," he said, avoiding my eyes. "I know this is weird, but my internet is out, and I have this report I have to finish. I was wondering if I could possibly use your Wi-Fi for like an hour." He looked up at me then, his expression so vulnerable it felt like a punch to the gut. "Honestly," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, I really don't want to be alone in my apartment right now. It's too quiet." There it was. The truth, stripped of all pretense. The silence he was running from was the very same silence I cultivated. He saw it as a vacuum, a void. I had always seen it as a sanctuary. But looking at him, I realized that any sanctuary, if occupied alone for too long, can become a prison. "Come in," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Of course, he didn't work on his report. He sat on my couch, laptop unopened on the coffee table, while Buster curled up on the rug at his feet, snoring softly. I made tea, an act of domesticity that felt both foreign and deeply natural. We didn't talk much. I put on a movie, some quiet, atmospheric film with more landscapes than dialogue. It was background noise, a gentle current to fill the silence he feared. He sat at one end of the couch, and I sat at the other, a continent of cushions between us. But the space felt charged. I was hyper-aware of him, of the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, of the way he stared at the screen without really seeing it. About halfway through the film, I glanced over and saw that his eyes were closed, his head leaning against the back of the sofa. He was asleep. I watched him for a long time. In sleep, the tension had drained from his face. The guardedness was gone, replaced by a childlike vulnerability. He looked younger, softer. The lines of worry around his eyes had smoothed out. I felt a powerful, protective urge, a feeling so intense it scared me. I got up quietly and retrieved a thick wool blanket from my linen closet. I draped it over him, my fingers brushing against the worn fabric of his jeans. The contact was electric, a spark that shot up my arm. He stirred, a soft mumble escaping his lips, and settled deeper into the cushions. I didn't wake him. I let him sleep there, on my couch, until the morning light began to filter through the windows. When he finally woke, disoriented and embarrassed, he stammered 1,000 apologies. I just smiled and told him it was fine. That night established the new pattern. It became our thing. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would knock on my door with a flimsy excuse. "Want to watch that new documentary?" Or, "I made way too much pasta. Want some?" He would come in, and we would settle onto the couch, the cushions between us a tacitly acknowledged buffer zone. And almost every time, he would fall asleep. At first, it was the same as that initial night. He'd drift off sitting up, and I'd cover him with the blanket, maintaining my distance. But the geography of the couch began to shift, slowly, glacially. One night, he fell asleep and his head slumped sideways, coming to rest on a throw pillow that was just inches from my thigh. My entire body went rigid. I sat there for 2 hours, barely breathing, terrified that if I moved, I would break the spell. The next time it happened, a week later, there was no pillow. He was exhausted, I could tell. He'd had a brutal week at work. He fell asleep within minutes of the movie starting, and this time, his head listed slowly, inexorably, until it came to rest gently on my shoulder. The contact was shocking in its intimacy. I could feel the warmth of him through my shirt, the soft texture of his hair against my neck. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My heart was a drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure it would wake him. I sat there, a living statue, my mind a raging torrent of questions. What did this mean? Was this a conscious act, or just the random physics of an exhausted body seeking comfort? Was I just a warm, convenient object, a substitute for a pillow? Or was this a deliberate, unspoken step across a line? He shifted in his sleep, a soft sigh escaping his lips, and his arm, which had been resting between us, draped loosely across my lap. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a movement of pure, unconscious trust. He felt safe with me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He felt safe enough to be completely, utterly vulnerable. And the terror that had been coiling in my stomach began to recede, replaced by a wave of profound, aching tenderness. This ritual, born of his loneliness and my silence, had become the most important thing in my life. It was a fragile, beautiful, terrifying thing, this space we had created, and I had no idea where it was leading, only that I would do anything to keep it from breaking. The ritual continued for 2 months, a silent, delicate dance of proximity and denial. The couch became our shared territory, a landscape where the boundaries between friendship and something more blurred into an ambiguous fog. His hand would find its way to rest on the cushion next to my leg. My arm would be draped along the back of the sofa, my fingers inches from his hair. We never spoke of it. In the morning, or when he would stir late at night, he would pull away with a mumbled apology for falling asleep again, and I would say it was no problem, my voice a carefully constructed mask of casualness. We were masters of plausible deniability. He was just tired. I was just being a good friend. But the air between us grew thick with unspoken electricity, with the weight of all the things we were not saying. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged with meaning, a living presence in the room. I lived for those nights, for the quiet intimacy of his sleeping presence. My photography began to change. The vast, empty landscapes I had always been drawn to started to feel lonely. I found myself focusing on smaller details, the way light filtered through a leaf, the intricate pattern of frost on a window pane, the texture of weathered wood. I was learning to see intimacy in the world because I was finally experiencing it. But the comfort of our ritual was always shadowed by a profound anxiety. I was analyzing every breath, every twitch, every subtle shift in his weight against me. I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I didn't even know what crime I was investigating. Was I imagining it all? Was I projecting my own desperate yearning onto his simple need for comfort? The fear that I was misinterpreting everything was a constant, cold knot in my stomach. To risk naming what was happening between us felt like risking the entire fragile ecosystem we had built. The friendship, this strange and beautiful lifeline, was too precious to lose. So I remained silent, the quiet observer, cataloging each moment and praying for a sign that wasn't a figment of my own hope. The crossing happened on a Friday. It had been a long week for both of us. A project of mine had hit a snag, and he had been dealing with a difficult client. The exhaustion hung in the air between us like humidity. He arrived at my door without any pretense this time, no offer of takeout or suggestion of a movie. He just looked at me, his eyes dark with fatigue, and said, "Can I just sit here for a while?" I nodded, and he walked in, shedding his shoes and jacket by the door. He didn't even turn on the television. He just sank into his usual spot on the couch, and I took mine. We sat in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sigh of city traffic. The rain had started again, a soft, persistent drumming against the window pane. It was a peaceful sound, a cocoon of white noise around us. This time, he didn't fall asleep. He just sat there, His head leaned back, his eyes closed. After a long time, he spoke, his voice low and soft, barely more than a murmur. "You know," he began, his eyes still closed. "My old apartment, the one I shared with Chloe, it was always so loud. Music, the TV, friends over. Always something happening. I thought that was what I wanted. I thought silence was bad. Like something was wrong." He turned his head, his eyes opening to look at me. The vulnerability in his gaze was a physical thing, something I could almost touch. "Your apartment is the quietest place I've ever been. And it's the only place I feel like I can actually breathe, my own breath caught in my throat." His words were a key, unlocking a door inside me I didn't even know was there. He understood. He understood the peace I had found in the quiet, the sanctuary I had built. He wasn't just hiding here. He was healing here. He shifted on the couch, turning his body to face me more directly. The space between us, once a vast continent, had shrunk to a small, trembling isthmus. His knee was now touching mine. The contact point was a blaze of heat. He didn't pull away. His eyes searched mine, and I saw a storm of emotions in their mossy depths: fear, confusion, and a startling, profound sincerity. "Alex," he said, using my name. It sounded different in his mouth, freighted with a new kind of weight. Can I ask you a question?" I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. He swallowed, his gaze dropping for a second to my mouth before returning to my eyes. The air crackled. The world narrowed to the space between our faces, to the sound of the rain and our own ragged breathing. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, the words so quiet I felt them more than heard them. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" Time stopped. The question hung in the air between us, a perfect, fragile sphere of glass. It was not a proposition, it was a plea. It was a request for permission, an act of profound deference to my boundaries, to our friendship. He was giving me the power, giving me an out. I could have said no. I could have laughed it off, pretended it was a joke, and our ritual could have continued, a little more awkward, a little more strained, but intact. But looking at his face, at the raw hope and terror warring in his eyes, I knew that silence was no longer an option. The observer had to become a participant. I didn't speak. I simply leaned forward, closing the final few inches between us. His breath hitched. My hand came up, of its own volition, to cup his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble there. And then I kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, of fire and demand. It was a kiss of quiet discovery. It was tentative, soft, a question answered with a question. His lips were hesitant at first, then they softened against mine, a yielding, a surrender. His hand came up to rest on my chest, right over my heart, as if he could feel the frantic, wild rhythm of it and wanted to calm it. The kiss was a confession. It tasted of rain and tea and 2 months of unspoken yearning. It was the sound of a wall finally coming down. When we pulled apart, we just looked at each other, our foreheads resting together. The silence that returned was not the silence of loneliness or of unspoken tension. It was a new kind of silence. It was the silence of after, the silence of a shared, terrifying, beautiful beginning. The beautiful beginning lasted for exactly 12 hours. The aftermath was a silent, brutal retreat. He left my apartment before dawn, a hurried, whispered excuse about an early meeting. He didn't meet my eyes. The kiss, which had felt so momentous, so solid and real in the rainy quiet of the night, seemed to evaporate in the harsh light of morning. He was gone, and the space on the couch where he had been felt like a wound. I told myself he was just processing. I told myself this was new for him, that he needed time. I replayed the kiss in my mind, a constant loop, searching for any sign that I had misread it, that I had forced it. But I couldn't find one. The vulnerability in his eyes, the hesitant question on his lips, it had been real. I was sure of it. But the silence from next door was absolute. The familiar sounds of his morning routine were absent. By midday, a text message appeared on my phone, a single, sterile sentence. "Hey, about last night. I'm sorry. I was out of line. I'm just really confused right now." Confused. The word was a punch to the gut. It was a word of retreat, a word that built walls. It invalidated everything. It relegated our kiss to a symptom of his emotional turmoil, a meaningless blip, an error in judgment. The tenderness, the shared vulnerability, all of it felt cheapened, erased. The hope that had bloomed in my chest overnight withered and died. I felt like a fool. I had let him in, not just into my apartment, but into the carefully guarded quiet of my life. And he had treated it like a waiting room, a place to sit until he figured out where he was going next. The anger was a hot, surprising flush, followed by a familiar, crushing wave of loneliness. The wall between our apartments felt higher and thicker than ever before. I had been the quiet observer for so long, and the one time I chose to participate, to step into the frame, I had been burned. For 3 days, we were strangers again, but it was a far more painful kind of strangeness. Before, it was the easy anonymity of neighbors. Now, it was the suffocating, deliberate avoidance of two people who had shared something intimate and were now pretending it never happened. I heard his door open and would wait, holding my breath, until I heard it close before daring to leave my own apartment. The hallway became a minefield. The silence from 7B was no longer the silence of grief. It was the silence of avoidance. It was a rejection, loud and clear. I felt myself retreating, pulling back into the shell I had occupied for so long. The landscapes on my walls seemed to mock me, their vast emptiness a mirror of how I felt. I had allowed myself to believe that my quiet world could expand to hold someone else. I was wrong. It was only ever meant for one. On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The pain of the silence was worse than any painful truth he could tell me. The ambiguity was eating me alive. I knew that if I didn't do something, we would be lost to this awkward, polite distance forever. Our fragile connection would calcify into a permanent regret. Fear was a cold, heavy stone in my stomach, but the need for clarity was stronger. I had to know. Even if the answer was the one I dreaded, I had to hear it. I had to close the loop. So I walked out of my apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I crossed the 3 feet of hallway that felt like a mile. I knocked on the door of 7B. It took him a long time to answer. I could hear movement inside, a hesitation. I was about to give up, to retreat in defeat, when the lock clicked. The door opened a few inches. He was standing there, looking even worse than he had the first night he'd knocked on my door. He was unshaven, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on 3 days ago. He looked haunted. "Alex," he said, his voice a low croak. He wouldn't look at me. "Liam," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. I had rehearsed this. "We need to talk. I'm not angry. I need you to be honest with me. What happened the other night? If it was a mistake, if it was just your confusion, you have to tell me. I can handle it. What I can't handle is this." I gestured to the empty space between us, the hallway that had become a chasm. "I can't go back to pretending you're just a sound through the wall." He finally looked at me, and his face crumpled. The guarded mask he had been wearing shattered, and all the fear and misery underneath came pouring out. "It wasn't a mistake," he whispered, his voice breaking. "That's what's messing me up so much. It was the only thing that's felt real in months." He scrubbed a hand over his face, a gesture of pure exhaustion. Can you come in?" I stepped across his threshold for the first time. His apartment was the mirror opposite of mine. Where mine was sparse and ordered, his was cluttered and chaotic. Dishes were piled in the sink, clothes were draped over chairs. It was the physical manifestation of his mental state. It was the home of a man whose life had come undone. He sank down onto his own couch, a piece of furniture that looked unwelcoming and stiff compared to mine, and buried his face in his hands. Buster came over and nudged my hand with his wet nose, whining softly, as if asking me to fix his person. I sat down not next to Liam, but on the coffee table in front of him, forcing him to look at me when he was ready. "Talk to me," I said softly. "Tell me what you're so afraid of," and he did. The words came out in a torrent, a confession born of days of tortured silence. He told me about Chloe, a relationship that had been dying a slow death for years, a habit he hadn't known how to break. He told me he'd never, not once, considered being with a man. It wasn't on his radar, not a part of the story he had written for his own life. And then he met me. Or rather, He met the quiet peace of my apartment. He talked about how our evenings on the couch had become his only anchor, the only time his brain would shut off. He confessed that he had started looking forward to falling asleep on my shoulder, that he would feel a pang of disappointment on the nights he didn't. "And then I kissed you," he said, his voice raw with self-recrimination. And it felt right. It felt more right than anything with Chloe did for the last 5 years. And it terrified me. Because what does that mean? Who am I? I felt like I was drowning, like my whole life was a lie. And I was scared of pulling you down with me. You have this peaceful life. You're solid. I'm a mess. And I was so scared of ruining the one good thing I had. This friendship. Our quiet. I panicked. I listened. And as he spoke, the anger and hurt inside me began to dissolve, replaced by a profound, overwhelming wave of empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of himself. He wasn't running from me. He was running from a truth that threatened to rewrite his entire identity. He had withdrawn not out of cruelty, but out of a misguided, panicked attempt to protect me, to protect the sanctuary I had offered him. When he finished, he finally looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "I'm so sorry, Alex. I handled everything wrong. I hurt you, you did," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "But I understand why." I reached out and put my hand on his knee. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. "Liam, you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to label it. You don't have to know who you are tomorrow. All you have to know is what you feel right now." I took a breath, preparing to lay my own vulnerability on the table. What we had, what we have, it's not just a place for you to hide. It's real for me, too. I've been half in love with the ghost who lived next door for a year. Getting to know the man has been everything. A single tear tracked its way down his face. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against mine, just as he had after the kiss. This time, it wasn't a gesture of tentative discovery, but one of profound, exhausted relief. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a promise of a perfect future. But it was enough. It was a beginning. It was the sound of two broken, lonely people agreeing to be broken and lonely together. And in the chaotic mess of his apartment, surrounded by the debris of his old life, we started to build something new, something quiet and honest and real. The conversation in his apartment wasn't a magical fix. It was a demolition. It cleared the wreckage of misunderstanding and fear, leaving behind a foundation that was raw and uncertain, but honest. We didn't fall into each other's arms. There was no cinematic, passionate reunion. Instead, what followed was a period of quiet, deliberate reconstruction. We started over, but this time without the pretense, without the safety net of plausible deniability. The ambiguity that had been both a comfort and a torment was gone, replaced by a startling, sometimes terrifying, clarity. The ritual of the couch continued, but its nature was transformed. He would still come over in the evenings, but he no longer needed an excuse. The knock on my door was now a simple, confident tap. He would walk in, and the first thing he would do was find me, wherever I was in the apartment, and press a soft, questioning kiss to my lips. It was a check-in, a reaffirmation. "Are we still okay? Is this still real?" And I would kiss him back, a silent answer. "Yes, we are." He still fell asleep on the couch, curled against my side, but it was no longer an accident of exhaustion. It was a choice. His head would find my shoulder with a sense of purpose. His hand would seek mine in the dark, our fingers lacing together. The hypervigilant analysis in my mind quieted. I no longer had to decode his every breath. I could simply enjoy the solid, comforting weight of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, a lullaby that soothed the anxious corners of my own soul. We talked. We talked for hours, filling the quiet spaces that had once held so much tension with the stories of our lives. I told him about my nomadic childhood, about how my camera became my only constant friend, the reason I learned to find beauty in solitude. He told me about the pressure from his family, the life path that had been laid out for him that he had followed without question, until Chloe's departure had finally forced him to look up and realize he was on the wrong road entirely. We were two people who had mistaken loneliness for independence. We were learning, together, That vulnerability was not a weakness, but a bridge. His apartment started to look less like a disaster zone. I went over one Saturday and helped him pack up the last of Chloe's things, boxing up the ghosts and taping them shut. We cleaned, we ordered pizza, and for the first time, I saw his space not as a reflection of his chaos, but as a place with potential, a place waiting for a new life to be lived in it. One evening, about a month after our confrontation, we were on the couch, a movie playing, forgotten, on the screen. His head was in my lap, my fingers idly tracing patterns in his hair. It was a comfortable, domestic silence, the kind I had only ever read about. He was looking up at me, his expression soft and contemplative in the flickering light of the television. "Can I stay here tonight?" he asked, his voice low. "I mean, not on the couch. With you." The question was simple, but the weight of it was immense. It was another threshold. The couch had been our safe, transitional space. My bed was something else entirely. It was a place of ultimate intimacy, of shared dreams and morning light. It was an admission that this was not a temporary arrangement, not just a port in a storm. It was a destination. "I thought you'd never ask," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. That night, for the first time, he didn't go back to 7B. We lay in my bed, face to face in the darkness, not touching at first, just existing in the shared space. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could hear the soft sound of his breathing. It felt sacred. He reached out, his hand finding mine under the covers. "Is this okay?" he whispered into the dark. "It's more than okay," I whispered back. And I realized that the quiet I had always craved wasn't about the absence of sound. It was about the absence of noise, of static, of the need for performance or defense. With him, lying next to me in the dark, the silence was full. It was a presence, a shared language. It was the sound of being completely, utterly seen. He fell asleep with his hand in mine, and I stayed awake for a long time, watching the way the moonlight painted silver stripes across his face, feeling a sense of peace so profound it felt like coming home after a journey I hadn't even realized I was on. In the weeks that followed, the door to 7B was used less and less. His toothbrush appeared in my bathroom holder. A few of his shirts found their way into my closet. His dog, Buster, began to treat my apartment as a second home, his tail thumping a welcome against my leg whenever I walked through the door. We were building a life, not in grand, declarative gestures, but in 1,000 tiny, mundane acts of togetherness. Making coffee for 2 in the morning, arguing playfully over what to watch at night. The simple, profound comfort of knowing that the person whose presence had once been a source of intense anxiety and speculation was now the source of my greatest peace. I think about that first night sometimes, the chaos of Buster's arrival, the flustered, handsome stranger in my doorway. I think about the thresholds we cross without knowing it, the ordinary moments that fracture our lives into a before and an after. Our beginning was a random accident, a leash slipping, a door left ajar. But what we built from it was the most intentional thing I have ever done. We had been two lonely people living on opposite sides of a wall, hearing the muffled sounds of each other's lives without ever truly listening. We mistook the silence for an ending, for an absence. But it was only ever a beginning. It was the quiet space where something new and beautiful could finally begin to grow. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned, at long last, to create together.